The dedication page of my debut novel read, "For R who never let me give up. Simple, simple, clean, true," or so I believed when I wrote it 3 years ago, sitting in a coffee shop with rain against the windows and my heart still full of someone who had since become a stranger. I remember pressing my palm flat against the printed galley copy, feeling the slight texture of the ink, thinking, this is the right thing to do. Dedications are declarations. They are the part of a book that exists outside the story, the part that says, this is who I was when I made this. This is who mattered. The novel came out on a rainy spring Thursday. The reviews trickled in over the following weeks, and they were good. Better than good, actually. My editor called me twice in the same afternoon, which she had never done before, and the second time, she laughed in a way that made me sit down on my kitchen floor because my legs forgot how to work. A prominent literary magazine called the book assured and emotionally devastating. A blogger with a following I still can't quite fathom said it made him ugly cry on the subway, and he wasn't even sorry about it. None of that is what changed my life. What changed my life was a man who sent my publisher a letter, an actual paper letter, handwritten, in ink, that bled slightly at the curves of certain letters, about the dedication page. Not the story. The dedication page. 2 sentences, and then a question. My name is Ronnie Pierce. I write literary fiction with romantic undercurrents, which is a fancy way of saying, I write love stories that are too sad to market as love stories. I live alone in an apartment that has good light in the mornings and smells permanently of coffee and old paperbacks. I have one cat named Marguerite who does not love me but tolerates my presence, and I had, until 8 months ago, considered myself more or less resigned to a particular kind of quiet life. Then, the letter arrived. My editor forwarded it to me with a note that said only, "This one's different. Read it." I read it, standing at my kitchen counter, still in the clothes I'd slept in, with coffee going cold beside me. "Mr. Mast Pierce," it began, in handwriting that was careful without being stiff, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who'd taught himself precision out of sheer stubbornness. "I finished your novel last night, and I want to be honest, I wasn't prepared for it. I've read a lot of books. I read them the way some people watch television, constantly, automatically, without always paying close attention. Yours made me pay attention. But I'm not writing about the book. I'm writing about the dedication. For R, who never let me give up. I don't know who R is. I don't need to. What I want to tell you is that your dedication page is the saddest thing in the book, and I think you already know that. I think you wrote it that way on purpose. I think R is gone, and you're still talking to them in the only language left, the front matter of a novel no one reads carefully enough. I read it carefully. My question, do you write because you have to, or because you're still trying to reach someone? Sincerely, Scott Blackwell. There was a return address in the upper left corner. No email, no phone number, just an address. And the kind of audacity that only comes from someone who either doesn't care what you think of them or cares so deeply they've looped all the way around to fearless. I stood at my counter for a long time. Marguerite wound around my ankles once and then gave up on me, which is her version of comfort. The coffee went fully cold. Outside, the street was doing its usual morning things. Delivery trucks, someone's music from an open window. The sound of the city not caring at all about the state of my interior life. The letter asked a real question and it deserved a real answer. I wrote back that afternoon, on paper, because it felt wrong to respond any other way. See, Mr. Blackwell, your letter was forwarded to me by my editor who has excellent instincts and apparently recognized that you were not sending fan mail. The honest answer to your question is both. I write because I have to, the way some people have to run or drink or make things with their hands. It's a compulsion before it's anything else. But underneath the compulsion, yes, there was someone. You're right that the dedication is the saddest part of the book, and you're right that I knew that when I wrote it. I wrote it anyway because the alternative was not saying it at all, and I wasn't ready for that. SAR is not gone the way dead people are gone. R is gone the way people go when they're still alive, somewhere in the world, but the version of them that loved you has quietly ceased to exist. That's a particular kind of loss that doesn't get a name or a ritual, and I think that's why I needed a novel. S. Your observation that no one reads the dedication page carefully enough is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in the last year. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or unsettled by the fact that a stranger read mine more carefully than most people who knew me. Esks, I don't know why you wrote on paper. I'm glad you did. Ek. Ronnie Piersek. His response came 11 days later. I'd almost stopped checking the mail, almost, but not quite, which tells you something about the particular brand of hope I was nursing without admitting it. The second letter was longer. He told me his name was Scott, and that he'd grown up in a place with winters that lasted too long, and summers that smelled like cut grass and motor oil. He told me he worked in structural engineering, which he described as the practice of ensuring things don't fall down, which is less heroic than it sounds but more important than most people realize. HTTHT. He told me he'd bought my book because the cover was ugly in a way that felt deliberate, his words, and that he'd almost put it back 3 times before finally buying it out of something between stubbornness and spite. He told me he had a sister who'd been sick and that he'd read the last 100 pages of my novel in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning, and that the crying he did in that waiting room was the first crying he'd done in 4 years, and he wasn't sure whether to thank me for it or hold it against me. At the bottom, you said R is gone the way people go when the version of them that loved you ceases to exist. I've been thinking about that for 11 days. I think I've experienced the inverse of that. I think I'm the one who ceased. I think someone is out there somewhere with a version of me that disappeared, and I don't know how to explain that to anyone who hasn't felt it. G. I'm explaining it to you because your book makes me think you'd understand. ZS, Scots. I read the letters sitting on my couch with my knees pulled up, Marguerite inexplicably present and pressed against my hip, which she does once in a great while when she senses that the human situation warrants intervention. I understood. God, I understood. We wrote to each other for 4 months before either of us suggested anything else. It was the most deliberately old-fashioned thing I'd ever participated in, and I say that as someone who still buys physical books and owns a typewriter I occasionally use when I want to feel pretentious. But there was something about the letters, the pace of them, the weight of them. The fact that writing by hand made you slow down and mean every word. That felt essential in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Like we were building something that needed to be built carefully, with good materials, without rushing. I learned things about Scott in the order he chose to tell them, which is a different experience than learning things about a person through the usual social archaeology of mutual friends and shared timelines. There was no context I hadn't been given permission to have. He told me he was 34, 2 years older than me. He told me he'd been in one long relationship that had ended badly, not dramatically, but badly. The kind of ending that happens slowly and then all at once. Like a house settling into its foundation until one day a wall cracks straight through. He told me he had a dog named after a mathematician, which I found unbearably charming without understanding why. He told me he cooked badly but enthusiastically, and that his kitchen showed the evidence. I told him things I hadn't told anyone in a long time. That R was someone I'd loved for 3 years and lost in the quiet way of 2 people growing into shapes that no longer fit together. That I'd started the novel 6 weeks after the end of Us, not as therapy. I'm suspicious of writing as therapy. It makes for bad literature, but as a way of understanding what had happened by rendering it at a slight remove. That the dedication was true, and I wasn't sure if I regretted it. That I was lonely in the specific way that people who are good at being alone eventually get lonely. Not desperately, not loudly, just with this low, persistent hum, like a refrigerator in an otherwise quiet room. His letter in response to that one was the shortest he ever sent. I know that hum. I've been listening to it for 2 years. I'd forgotten there was a name for it. I'd like to call you, if that's something you'd want. I want to hear your voice before I lose my nerve entirely. CX Socksai. I called him that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. Ronnie Pierce, he said, and the way he said my name, like he was testing the shape of it, making sure it matched whatever he'd built in his head over 4 months of letters, made something in my chest go very still. I'd read my own name 1,000 times. I'd signed it on book contracts, grocery lists, cards to people I'd known 20 years. I'd never heard it said like that, like it was something being confirmed rather than announced. Scott Blackwell, I said back, for the same reason. We both went quiet for a moment, not awkwardly. The silence had the quality of a room being entered and looked around carefully before the furniture gets moved. You sound like I thought you would, he said finally. What did you think I'd sound like? He considered this seriously, which I'd already learned was what he did with questions. Like someone who chooses words carefully but doesn't labor over them. Like someone who talks to themselves while writing. Like someone who has had a lot of good conversations and is still slightly surprised when they happen. I sat down slowly on the couch. Marguerite materialized from wherever she'd been and regarded me with the amber-eyed suspicion she maintains toward anything new. That's accurate, I said. Disturbingly accurate. Your letters gave you away, he said. There was warmth in it, nothing pointed, just the matter-of-fact observation of someone who had been paying attention. And you? I said. Do I sound like you expected? A pause. No, he said. You sound better. Not better in quality. Better in the sense of more real. There's something about hearing a voice for the first time after months of only reading someone. The letters were good. This is better because it's irreversible. I can't reread a phone call. I can't go back and catch a word I missed. This is happening, and then it's happened. You're an engineer, I said, but you think like a writer. I think like someone who pays attention, he said. The discipline happens to be engineering. We talked for 3 hours. When I finally looked at the clock, it was past midnight, and I was lying on my back on the couch with Marguerite asleep on my feet. She had migrated there during our second hour without announcement, which is her version of approving something, and the lamp in the corner making everything warm and amber. We hadn't run out of things to say. We'd just reached a natural pause, the kind that comes not from exhaustion but from fullness, like a meal where you stop, not because the food is gone, but because you're genuinely, completely satisfied. I said I should probably sleep. He agreed. Neither of us hung up immediately. This was good, he said finally. Not fung or nice or any of the words people use when they mean something and can't quite say it directly. It was, I agreed. Another pause. Longer than the others, with something in it I couldn't name but recognized as the edge of something. Same time next week? Sure, I said. And then, because I'd spent 4 months saying real things to this man and it seemed wrong to stop now, I was nervous. Before I called. I know, he said. So was I. My hands were shaking. I kept washing them, and then they'd shake again. At some point, I washed them 4 times in 20 minutes, and my sister called and I answered and she said, "Why is your voice doing that?" And I said, "Doing what?" And she said that thing it does when you're terrified of something going wrong. And I said, "I'm calling someone's," and she said, "Who?" And I said, "A writer I've been corresponding with for 4 months." And there was a very long silence on her end. I laughed, a real laugh, not the social kind, a laugh that started somewhere in the chest and arrived with no preparation. What did she say? She said, "Scott, it is about time." Then she hung up. "I like her," I said. "She'd like you," he said. "She read your first novel. She hasn't told me yet that she cried at it, but I can tell she did." "People always tell me they didn't cry," I said, and then they describe crying in vivid detail. "That's what she did," he confirmed. "She told me your prose style was controlled in a way that made the emotion hit harder because you weren't performing it." I told her I thought so too, and she looked at me like I'd just said something new about myself. "Had you?" He thought about it. "Possibly. I don't usually say things like that." She made a note of it. My sister makes actual physical notes. She has a notebook for each person in her life, and she writes things down when they seem important. "That's the most touching thing I've heard this year," I said. It's embarrassing, he said. It's not, I said. It's the opposite of embarrassing. A pause. Then, with the careful warmth that was, I was learning, his particular register for sincerity, I'll add it to the list of things I've told you that I've never told anyone else. We hung up. I lay on my couch in the amber light for a long time, not sleeping, just feeling the particular shape of something beginning. The way you feel the shape of a room before the lights come on, by what you brush against in the dark. The phone calls became weekly, then twice weekly, then something I didn't count anymore because counting implied it was finite, and I'd stopped thinking of it that way. His voice was low and slightly rough, the kind that sounds like outdoor mornings and considered words. And I noticed with clinical detachment and no small amount of alarm that I'd begun to arrange my evenings around when he might call, that I saved things during the day, observations, strange moments, a sentence from whatever I was reading, to tell him later, that I thought about him more than I thought about R, which was the first real sign. 4 months of calls in, 8 months total from the first letter, he said, I want to meet you. We'd talked about this around the edges, the way you do when you're not quite ready to say the direct thing. He lived 4 hours away by train. We both noted this in the abstract. Neither of us had done anything about it. I know, I said. I keep almost booking the train and then not booking it. Why? A pause, longer than usual. Because it's good right now. It's really good right now, and meeting in person is a variable I can't control, and He stopped. You're what? I'm afraid of what happens if it doesn't. Another stop. I don't want to ruin this. I understood the fear completely. I also knew it was the wrong way to think about it. Scott. Yeah. We have been talking honestly to each other for 8 months. You know things about me that I haven't said out loud to anyone since the end of my last relationship. I know things about your family and your work and the way you feel about winter and what you do when you can't sleep. I know, he said quietly. The variable isn't really the meeting. The variable was always whether the person on the other end of these letters and calls was real, and we've both. I paused, choosing words carefully. We've both already answered that question. We just haven't said it. A very long silence. I'm booking the train, he said. Book the train, I agreed. He arrived on a Saturday morning in late autumn when the trees were doing that last desperate beautiful thing before they gave up and went bare. I was at the station 20 minutes early because I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer, couldn't stop rearranging things and then rearranging them back. Marguerite had watched me with the expression she reserves for my most incomprehensible behavior. I stood on the platform with my hands in my coat pockets and my heart doing something complicated and waited. The train arrived. People streamed out in that particular crowdway, a collective organism of rolling suitcases and phone screens and people looking past each other toward whoever they were waiting for. And then I saw him. He was taller than I'd pictured, though I hadn't consciously pictured him, or so I'd told myself, which turned out to be a lie. And he moved through the crowd with the slightly careful way of someone who has learned not to take up too much space even when he's tall enough that he easily could. He was wearing a dark coat and carrying a bag over one shoulder, and he was looking around the platform with an expression I recognized, the specific expression of someone looking for a face they've never seen but already know. He found mine. And what happened in his face in that moment? The small, precise shift from searching to finding the way something in him seemed to steady and then immediately, visibly, become nervous again. That expression became one of the most important things I'd ever witnessed. I filed it away immediately, the way I file away things that matter, carefully, in a place I won't lose them. He walked toward me and I walked toward him, and we met in the middle of the platform with a foot of space between us and the whole arriving crowd flowing around us, indifferent. Hi, he said. Hi, I said. Up close, his eyes were a particular shade that I later, in a notebook, tried and failed to name accurately. Brown, yes, but with something warm in the back of them, like light through old glass. You're taller than I thought, we both said, and then both stopped, and then both laughed. Not polite laughing, genuine laughing, the kind that breaks tension the way nothing else can. I researched you, he admitted, still smiling. I looked for photos online. There were two, and they were both from the wrong angle, and I still somehow managed to picture you about 4 inches shorter. I pictured you with a beard, I said. I don't know why. You don't have one. I had one 2 years ago. I shaved it when… Actually, that's a long story. I have time, I said. His smile shifted into something quieter and more real. Yeah, he said. I know you do. We stood there another moment in the station noise, and I thought, this is the thing I was afraid wouldn't match. And it matches. CS. The day was slow and good in the way that days are when you're not trying to make them anything. We walked. We had lunch in a place I liked, a small restaurant, with mismatched chairs and good natural light where they knew my usual order. And I watched Scott read the menu with the same focused attention I'd come to associate with the way he engaged with everything. He ordered something he'd never had before, on my recommendation, and ate it with the pleased expression of someone proven right to trust. We talked the way we always talked, easily, with room for silence, without performing. But there was a new layer now. The physical reality of each other, the way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking, the way he used his hands less than I expected from the energy in his letters, the way he listened with his whole body angled toward you like a compass finding north. In the afternoon, we walked along the river path. The trees were doing their last gasp performance, and the light was that specific late autumn gold that makes everything look like a memory, even while it's happening. He told me about his sister, Hannah, who'd been sick and was better now, who'd made him promise to stop being so careful with his own life after watching her fight for hers. She said, exact words, "Scott, you are so busy making sure nothing falls down that you haven't built anything for yourself in years." She sounds like a structural engineer, I said. He laughed. She's a kindergarten teacher. Somehow it's funnier coming from her. What did you do? After she said that, I went home. I thought about it for a week, and then I found your book at a shop on my way to work, and the cover was ugly in a deliberate way, and I almost put it back 3 times. I looked at him. And you wrote me a letter. I wrote you a letter, he confirmed. We walked in silence for a moment. Below us, the river was doing its slow, indifferent thing. I'm glad you didn't put it back, I said. I'm glad the cover was ugly, he said. He stayed 2 nights. On the first evening, we stayed up too late talking in my living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch with Marguerite inexplicably positioned between us, as though she'd assigned herself neutral territory. Scott had the instinct of someone who spent time around animals. He didn't reach for her or make a fuss, just let her exist near him. And within 2 hours, she was pressed against his leg with an ease she'd never granted me in 3 years of cohabitation, which I found personally offensive, and also somehow right. She doesn't do that, I said. She's doing it, he observed. She's never done that with anyone. He looked at me steadily for a moment. Do you want me to tell her to stop? Don't you dare, I said. He smiled at his hands. On the second day, we went to a bookshop, my favorite, the one with too many stairs and cats asleep on the shelves, and a section in the back labeled simply Things We Love But Can't Explain. Sex E, which is where most of my favorite discoveries have come from. Scott moved through the shop the way I'd hoped he would, slowly, with attention, occasionally pulling something down and reading the first page before deciding. He bought 4 books. I watched him choose each one. In the poetry section, small, tucked beside a window, he found a collection and went quiet in the particular way of someone who's just encountered words that fit. He didn't show me what he was reading. I didn't ask. Some moments need privacy even in company, and knowing when to give that is, I think, the beginning of understanding someone. He bought the collection along with the other 4. On the walk back, he said without looking at me, I've been trying to figure out what to say about this weekend. Don't say it if it's hard, I said. That's the thing. A pause. It's not. That's what I'm trying to figure out how to say. This isn't. He stopped and started again. I'd been so careful for so long, about everything, people especially, and this doesn't feel careful. It feels like something I didn't design, but that's been holding weight this whole time and I only just noticed. I knew that feeling. I'd been carrying a version of it for weeks without admitting what it was. Scott, I said. He looked at me. I think I'm probably in the process of falling in love with you, I said. I haven't done that in a long time, and I'm slightly terrified of it, but I wanted you to know. He stopped walking. We were on the sidewalk in the last of the afternoon light, people moving around us with ordinary purpose, and Scott Blackwell stood completely still and looked at me the way people look at things that are both surprising and inevitable. I've been in love with you, he said carefully, since the letter where you explained that you write because you're still trying to reach someone. That was 6 months ago. I've been trying not to say it because I didn't want to pressure you. I thought you were still. He stopped. I thought there wasn't room. There's room, I said. There's been room for a while. He breathed out slowly. We stood on the sidewalk in the autumn light for another moment, and then, very carefully, as though checking to make sure the ground would hold, he reached over and took my hand. His hand was warm and slightly rough at the edges, and it fit against mine with the particular ease of things that are simply true. We stood there a while longer. Then we kept walking. 4 hours by train is not, by most measures, a long distance. People maintain relationships across continents. I knew this. Scott knew this. We said it to each other with cheerful practicality in the weeks after his first visit, during which he came back twice more, and I went to him once. Each visit building on the last, the way chapters build. Not starting over but continuing layering. But 4 hours is also 4 hours, and there is a specific tax that distance levies not on affection but on the small ordinary fabric of a relationship. The spontaneous things. The bad days when you need a physical presence, not a voice. The Tuesday evenings that are nothing important and therefore exactly the right time to be in the same room doing nothing important together. I became aware of the tax slowly and then all at once, which is how these things tend to work. The novel I was working on. The second one, which my editor had been patient about in the way that editors who believe in you can afford to be patient, was going badly. Not writer's block badly, but structurally badly. The kind of problem where you can write words every day and still know somewhere in the core of you that the foundation is wrong. I worked on it in the mornings and then stared at what I'd written in the evenings and felt the low-grade despair of someone trying to build a house on ground that won't hold. I didn't tell Scott how bad it was. Not at first. We had a rhythm now. Calls most evenings, texts throughout the day, weekends when we could manage them, and I didn't want to spend our limited time together filling it with my professional anxiety. He had his own work, his own pressures. He was taking on a major project that involved a bridge, actually an actual bridge, which I found terrifying on his behalf, even though he assured me he'd done it before and that bridges were, structurally speaking, more predictable than people. But I wasn't telling him things, and I noticed I wasn't, and that noticing began to create its own specific kind of distance. Then came the night he called and could tell immediately, with an accuracy that still slightly unsettles me, that something was wrong. What happened? Not "Are you okay?" Not "Is everything all right?" Not "Is everything all right?" Directly, what happened? Nothing happened, I said. Ronnie. The way he said my name. That particular way, with the weight of knowing me. I put down the book I wasn't really reading. Marguerite looked up from her position on the armchair across the room. The novel is broken, I said. Not writer's block. Structurally broken. The whole premise has a crack in it that I've been trying to build around for 4 months, and it's not working, and I think I might have wasted a year. A pause. Then, tell me where the crack is. You don't know anything about. I know about cracks, he said. Tell me where it is. So I told him. About the second act that collapsed under its own weight, about the character whose motivations I'd been forcing rather than discovering, about the scene I kept rewriting that refused to do the structural work I needed it to do. I talked for 40 minutes, getting increasingly tangled in my own problems, and he listened without interrupting, which requires a particular kind of discipline, and then, when I finally ran out of words, said, "The scene isn't doing the work because it's the wrong scene. The work needs to happen earlier. You're trying to resolve something the reader hasn't been made to feel yet." I went very still. You've built the resolution before you've built the wound, he said. I stared at the ceiling. Yes, I said slowly, that's exactly it. Build the wound first. Build the wound first, I repeated. I opened the manuscript document on my laptop before we'd even hung up. He could hear me typing, and he didn't say anything about it. We stayed on the call, him quiet on his end, me working, for another half hour, until the shape of what needed to happen had become clear enough to hold. Thank you, I said finally. I just asked where the crack was, he said. You knew how to fix it. Don't do that. Don't do what? Deflect the thing you just did. You just fixed my novel. You fixed your novel, he said firmly. I asked the right question. I smiled at my laptop screen. You're going to be insufferable when you're right. I was told something similar once about structural engineering, he said, with a warmth that made the distance, for that particular moment, feel very small. But the distance remained, and 3 months into what I'd privately begun thinking of as our real life together, the life after the letters, after the first visit, after all the things we'd said on sidewalks and in bookshops, I started to feel the weight of it differently, not as a manageable inconvenience, but as an actual structural problem, which, given who I was in love with, I recognized was ironic. We had a bad weekend. Not a fight, exactly. Scott and I moved around conflicts with more awareness than that, with the habits of two people who'd learned to say real things before they became resentments. But we had a weekend where he was supposed to come, and the bridge project demanded unexpected hours, and he couldn't. And I had a reading event that same weekend that went well by any external measure, but felt hollow afterward in the way things sometimes do when you want to share them with someone specific and they're 4 hours away. I came home from the reading to my empty apartment and sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine and the particular quiet of a life that is full in many ways and missing one specific thing in a way that makes the fullness feel strange. I texted him, "The reading went well. I wanted you to be there." He replied immediately, which meant he'd been awake and waiting. "I'm sorry I missed it. I wanted to be there too. Tell me everything. HPS. And I did. I told him everything, lying on my couch with the lamp on, and Marguerite finally, uncharacteristically, on my chest, her weight a small warm anchor. He asked questions. He laughed in the right places. He said all the right things, genuinely, not as performance, and when we hung up, I stared at the ceiling and thought, this is not sustainable in the way things that matter are not sustainable, not because it's falling apart, but because it deserves more than this. I had been thinking about the dedication page of my novel for weeks, the one that read, "For R, who never let me give up." The one that Scott had written me a letter about, because he'd read it more carefully than anyone else. I'd been thinking about who belongs on a dedication page. What it means to put someone there. What it means to carry them through the act of making something and arrive at the end and realize they are woven into the whole structure. I opened my laptop that night after the reading and wrote for 2 hours. Not the novel, something else. I need to tell you about the dedication of my second novel, which was the thing that finally made everything clear, not just to me, but to Scott, and in a way I hadn't anticipated, to anyone who read it. The second novel was about two people who spend years building walls they then have to dismantle, which is very much not autobiographical except in every way that matters. I finished it on a cold morning in January, the kind of morning that feels like an ending and a beginning at the same time, which is, I've decided, the only appropriate weather for finishing a novel. I wrote the dedication 3 times. The first time I wrote, "For Scott, who asks where the crack is." Ask. I stared at it, deleted it. The second time I wrote, "For S, who built things that held." Stared at it longer, deleted it again. The third time I sat at my desk for an hour without writing anything, just thinking about what dedications actually do. They're not just thank yous, they're not just acknowledgments. The best ones are small acts of public love. The best ones say, here is who I was carrying when I made this. Here is who I would have you know about me. The third dedication I wrote was this, for Scott Blackwell, who read a dedication page more carefully than anyone had a right to, and changed my entire life by asking one question. Thank you for building things that hold. I intend to be one of them. I sent it to my editor. She called me 20 minutes later. Ronnie Pierce, she said. Sarah, I said, this dedication. I know. Does he know? Not yet, I said. A long pause. You understand that when this book comes out, an extremely observant structural engineer is going to read the dedication of your novel and potentially have a heart attack. I'm counting on his structural soundness, I said. She laughed. I'm approving this dedication. I'm also telling you that you need to tell him before the book comes out. I know, I said. I'm going to. Good, she said. Also, Ronnie, this is the best novel you've written. I stared at my laptop. Because of the wound thing? Because of all of it. Because you wrote it like you had something real to lose. That's a different book than the first one. After she hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time. Marguerite jumped up and settled on the corner of the desk, which she does when she's decided I need witnessing rather than comfort. I picked up my phone. I did not, as I'd been intending for weeks, call Scott. Instead, I bought a train ticket. The trip takes 4 hours and 14 minutes, and I spent most of it staring at the landscape, doing its winter thing outside the window, and revising, for the 40th time, what I intended to say. I had thoughts. I had whole paragraphs drafted. I am a novelist. I do words professionally. I had no idea what I was going to say. He didn't know I was coming. I'd texted only, "Are you home this evening? I want to talk, but in person." And he'd replied within 2 minutes. This man, who I had discovered was constitutionally incapable of waiting more than 5 minutes before worrying, was, "Yes, is everything all right?" I wrote back, "Everything is very all right. I'll explain when I get there." His response, "When you get here? You're coming here?" Me. Train gets in at 60:40. And then, after what I could imagine was a very expressive silence on his end, "I'll be at the station." He was. Of course he was. Standing on the platform in his coat, slightly too still in the way he got when he was containing something. I saw him before he saw me and took one moment to just see him. The particular set of his shoulders. The way he was scanning the arriving passengers with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He found me. That shift in his face again, searching to finding to something that had no name but felt like recognition, like, there you are. I crossed the platform and stopped in front of him. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said. "You came," he said, slightly stupidly, with the tone of someone whose brain is lagging behind the reality of the situation. "I came," I agreed. We stood on the platform. "What's happening?" he asked. "I finished the novel," I said. He waited. "And I wrote the dedication," I said. "And I need to tell you what's on it, in person. Because it seemed wrong to do it any other way." He was very still now. The kind of stillness that is not absence but attention. His entire attention, directed at me with a precision that still, even after a year of knowing him, made me feel both seen and slightly off balance. "What's on the dedication page?" he asked. I took a breath. "Your name," I said. "Your full name. And it says that you changed my life by reading carefully and asking one question. And it says, I intend to be one of the things you've built." He was quiet for a long moment. The platform was moving around us the way platforms do. Luggage, voices, the mechanical sounds of trains, and we were both very still in the middle of it. "Ronnie," he said. I know the book will be out and anyone who reads it will." "Ronnie," he said again. No, and I know that's a thing, and if that's too much, then we can talk to my editor about." "Stop," he said very gently. I stopped. He reached up and put one hand along the side of my face, the way you touch something you're afraid of dropping. His hand was warm. It was cold on the platform, and his hand was warm, and his thumb brushed very lightly against my cheekbone, and he looked at me with those particular eyes, the color I'd never been able to name correctly, and said, "You put my name on the dedication page of your novel." "Yes," I said. "The whole name. Scott Blackwell." "A whole name." His jaw worked slightly. "Do you know what you're saying?" "I know exactly what I'm saying," I said. I've known for a while. I'm sorry it took me this long to get here." "I'm not," he said. "I would have waited." "I know," I said. "That's partly why I'm here." He looked at me for another long moment, and then with the same careful precision he brought to everything, the steadiness of someone who checks the math before he builds, who understands the difference between weight and load-bearing capacity. He kissed me, on the platform, with the ordinary world flowing around us. His mouth was warm, and he kissed me the way the letters had always felt, deliberately, with care, like something he'd thought about and meant. I put my hand against his chest and felt the particular solidity of him, the held breath slowly releasing. And I thought with a distant part of my brain that was still observing, this is what it feels like to be where you're supposed to be. When he pulled back slightly, his eyes were bright. "Your whole name," I said, slightly breathless. "On the dedication page." "I heard you the first time," he said, which is what he says when something has moved him too much to be eloquent. "Good," I said. "I need you to have actually heard it." "I heard it," he said. "Ronnie." Yeah, move here," he said. I blinked. "That was, I know it's fast. I know you have your apartment and Marguerite and Scott." He stopped. "Yes," I said. A pause. Yes. I was planning to." I stopped and started again. "I've been thinking about it for 2 months. I've been afraid to say it because I didn't want to pressure you or assume things, and also I have a cat who hates everyone and a very particular relationship with my kitchen, and also—" "Ronnie," he said softly. "Yeah." "Stop talking." "Okay." He pulled me in, and I went pressing my face against the side of his neck, and he wrapped his arms around me on the train platform with the same steadiness that he brought to everything. And I thought, build the wound first, then the resolution. I'd built the wound 3 years ago. The resolution was here, in the particular warmth of these arms on this platform, with the winter light going golden and the train on the track behind us and a whole ordinary life somewhere ahead. Moving is logistics, and then suddenly it's your whole life in boxes, and then suddenly it's your life unpacked in someone else's space, and then the first time you wake up in the morning, and the morning is normal. It's just your life. I spent the better part of a week before the move sitting in my old apartment, looking at things and deciding whether they were mine, in the essential sense, or just objects that had accumulated around me the way objects do when you live somewhere long enough. I kept more than I should have, and less than I'd expected. The kitchen things mattered. The desk mattered. Certain books that I couldn't have articulated a reason for, except that they'd been there during the important times. The breakup, the first novel, the long winter of the second one. Those came. The actual move was conducted in a state of mild chaos that Scott approached with the methodical calm of someone who finds disorder professionally offensive. He drove the hired van himself, insisted on carrying more than was reasonable, and at one point stood in the middle of his living room surrounded by my boxes and said, with a contentment I found slightly alarming in its completeness, "This is good. This is really good." "We haven't put anything away yet," I said. "I know," he said. "It still looks right." It took approximately 6 weeks for Marguerite to forgive me for the upheaval. The dog, Euler, named for the mathematician, completely impossible not to love, met her at the door and was enthusiastically rebuffed, which he took with an equanimity that is perhaps the most Euler-like thing about him. He had the demeanor of a being who has decided that the world is fundamentally fine and that temporary setbacks are simply part of the texture. Marguerite had the demeanor of a being who had decided the world was fundamentally suspicious and had not been given sufficient evidence to revise this view. Scott installed a very tall cat shelf specifically for Marguerite, so she could survey her new domain from above. He did this without announcement, without making a thing of it. Just measured, ordered the materials, built it on a Sunday while I was working, and called me over to see. The shelf ran along the upper part of the living room wall, stepped at intervals, ending in a padded perch near the window with the view of the street and the rooftops. "You built that," I said. "Small structures are structurally less interesting, but more personally satisfying, he said, which I subsequently wrote down verbatim in my notebook. Marguerite approached it with suspicion, then with scientific investigation, then, 3 days later, with the proprietary ease of something she had always owned. Within a month, she was sleeping in a spot when he got up in the mornings, which I'd have been offended about if it weren't so consistent with her character. Euler had been sleeping in mine from day one. He's less strategic about it. He's less strategic about everything. What he lacks in strategy he makes up for in warmth. And there is something to be said for going to sleep with a solid warm weight at your feet that is simply, uncomplicatedly happy you're there. Living with Scott was the adjustment I'd been privately terrified of. I am a specific person with specific habits, and I'd lived alone long enough to have opinions about the organization of things, and it was almost entirely fine, which was itself slightly suspicious. The way things that go smoothly make you briefly wonder where the catch is. The catch, it turned out, was not a catch. The catch was that we were two people who had learned to be honest with each other before we were in the same room, which meant that when we disagreed about the kitchen organization, about the way he stacked books spine out on the shelves, which I found chaotic, about the temperature at which the apartment should be kept in winter, about 1,000 small things. We already had the habit of saying so, not dramatically, not with accumulated resentments. Just, this is the thing, here's why it matters to me, what do we do about it? He rearranged the bookshelves. I conceded on the temperature. We split the kitchen organization problem in half, each controlling the section we cared about most, which resulted in a kitchen that an outside observer would probably find eccentric and which worked perfectly. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how much of Scott lived in his dailiness, in the specific, texture-heavy, unheroic fabric of ordinary days. He made coffee before I was awake, 2 cups, one of which was waiting when I got up. He left specific notes, not messages on his phone, actual paper notes, brief, practical, occasionally funny. He read in the evenings with a focus that I recognized from myself, and that made the companionable silence of 2 people reading in the same room feel like one of the more complete experiences I'd had. He laughed at things privately, to himself, without explaining what, books, I suspected, or something he was thinking, and the private laugh was quieter than his social one, and I preferred it. He had habits that I cataloged without meaning to, the way I catalog everything. He thought with his hands, sketching things on scraps of paper, not art, but structures, quick geometric solutions to problems he was working through. He took longer showers in winter than summer. He answered texts immediately or not at all, no middle ground. He was constitutionally incapable of leaving a coffee ring on the counter without wiping it, which I found inexplicably moving. I write in the mornings. He left early, came back in the evenings smelling of outside. He cooked badly and enthusiastically, and I ate what he made with genuine appreciation because the enthusiasm was, in some essential way, the point. On evenings when the work had been good, I would sit across from him at the table and tell him about it, and he listened with the whole body attention I'd noticed on the platform the first time and had never stopped noticing. On evenings when the work had been hard, he'd say, "Where's the crack?" And we'd find it. The novel came out in April. Spring again. My debut had been spring. My second would be spring, which feels meaningful but is probably just publishing schedules. The galley copies arrived in boxes, and I stood in our living room holding one and was struck by the strange recursive reality of it. I was holding a book that contained on its second page the evidence of how I'd gotten here. Scott came home to find me sitting on the floor with the galley copy open to the dedication page. He stood in the doorway and looked at me. "It's here," I said. He crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside me and looked at the page. His name in the particular font the designer had chosen, in the clean white space that all dedications get. For Scott Blackwell, who read a dedication page more carefully than anyone had a right to and changed my entire life by asking one question. "Thank you for building things that hold. I intend to be one of them." He read it in silence. "You never let me read it until now," he said. "I told you what it said." "It's different seeing it," he said. I looked at him. His face had done the thing it did when he was moved, but maintaining composure, the slight tightening around his eyes, the jaw that set and then released. Yeah, I agreed. We sat on the floor with the galley copy for a while. Euler arrived and flopped across both our laps with the total lack of concern for personal space that is his primary personality trait. Marguerite observed from the shelf. The first dedication, Scott said finally. The one in the first novel. R. You said R was gone in the way of people who are still alive somewhere, but the version of them that loved you has ceased. Yeah, I said. Is that still? He stopped. How is that now? I thought about it honestly, the way he'd always asked me to think about things, without the protective gloss of the easy answer. It's like a place I used to live, I said finally. I don't want to go back. I don't feel the loss the same way. But it shaped me into the person who could write the first book, and the first book is what you read, and the letter you sent. I paused. So in some strange way, R is part of how I got here. That's not nothing. It's also not pain anymore. Scott was quiet. Do you ever think about the one who, I started, who disappeared, he said, who stopped being who they were to someone else? Yes, less than I used to. A pause. Also like a place I used to live. Good, I said. Yeah, he said. Good. Euler shifted across our laps. The light was doing its late afternoon thing, coming golden through the windows. I'm going to be on every dedication page, Scott said, not as a question but with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided something important. I looked at him. That sounds dangerously close to planning for the future. I'm a structural engineer, he said. Planning for the future is my entire job. Fair, I said. Then yes, everyone. He leaned over and pressed his mouth to my temple, brief and certain, and I thought with the part of me that's always watching, always filing things away, always making note of things that matter, this is what I'll remember. Not the book launch, not the reviews. This, the floor, the galley copy, the dog across both our laps, and this man who read the saddest 2 sentences of my first novel and wrote me a letter on paper because anything else would have been insufficient. J. The book launched and the world did its book launch things around it. Reviews, interviews, an event or two. A particular literary podcast that asked very good questions and had good listeners, including it, turned out several people who wrote to me about the dedication, which I'd been warned about by my editor, but which I was still not entirely prepared for. A woman wrote to say she'd read the first book's dedication, for RRR, and then the second's, for Scott Blackwell, and that the journey from one to the other had made her feel something she couldn't name. Like watching someone find their way back, she wrote. Like the story happened in the white space between the 2 dedications. I read it to Scott at breakfast. He was doing the thing he did with his coffee, holding it with both hands without drinking it, which means he's thinking. She's right, he said. The story did happen there. I know, I said. That's the strange thing about publishing. The story you made is also, apparently, the story you lived. He put down his coffee. He had the look he got when he was deciding to say something. Tell me, I said. He looked at me. Will you marry me? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the street was doing its morning thing, indifferent as always. Euler was asleep on the mat near the door. Marguerite was in her usual morning position on the counter near the window, which she knows she's not supposed to be on and which neither of us actually enforces. The kitchen was very quiet, and Scott was looking at me with those eyes that I'd spent a year failing to name the color of, and still couldn't. And he had the expression of someone who has thought about something for a long time and decided the thinking was finished. That's, I started. I don't have a ring, he said. I thought about getting one, and then I thought that you would probably want to choose it yourself, or that we'd choose it, which seemed more like us. I thought about doing something elaborate, and then I thought that elaborate is not. He stopped. This is us. Breakfast. This is the thing I want to ask you in. I stared at him. Ronnie, he said, will you marry me? Yes, I said. He let out a breath that he must have been holding for some time. Yes, I said again, because it bore repeating, because once was not enough. Obviously, yes. You're asking me to marry you over coffee in a kitchen where I have very particular opinions about the organization of the lower cabinets, and you've accepted that, which is, Ronnie, he said, yeah. Stop talking, he said, and the smile was breaking through the composure now. The real smile, the one I'd cataloged first in the bookshop when he'd found the poetry collection. Okay, I said. He stood up from his side of the table, and I stood up from mine, and we met in the middle of the kitchen, which was how we always met, in the middle. And he put his arms around me, and I put mine around him, and we stood in the morning kitchen, and I thought, here it is. Here is the thing that holds. My third novel, which I am writing now in the mornings, in the good light of our apartment, with Euler asleep under the desk and Marguerite supervising from above, has a dedication that I wrote on the first day of drafting before I knew how the story would go. Dedications, I have learned, are not summaries. They are not conclusions. They are the thing you carry with you before you know what you're making, the person in the room while you build. The third dedication reads, for Scott Blackwell, again, it will always be again. And for anyone who ever read a dedication page carefully enough to wonder who was on it, you were right to wonder. The whole story is there if you know how to look. I showed it to Scott one morning while he was still half asleep with coffee, which is an unfair time to show someone something that matters. And he read it twice and then set it down on the table and looked at me with the soft, unguarded expression he has before the day has fully assembled itself. The whole story, he said. The whole story, I agreed. He picked up his coffee. He was quiet for a moment. The first time I read your name, he said, your actual full name, Ronnie Pierce, on the cover of the book, I almost didn't buy it. The cover was ugly. The name was, I don't know. It was just a name. And now, I said. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee. And now, he said, it's my favorite name. I had no answer for that. That wasn't embarrassing, so I didn't say anything, just looked at him in the morning light with the full knowledge of everything I was going to put in this novel because of him. Everything I'd already put in the last one. The whole arc of a love story that started with a paper letter and a dedication page, and a man who read carefully enough to ask the right question. I write because I have to. That was always true. But I write for him now too. Not in the desperate reaching way of the first book. Not in the language of loss, but in the language of someone who has the person in the room right there. Coffee going warm in both hands. Eyes that I've spent 2 years trying to accurately describe and haven't quite managed, voice that I built my whole daily life around before I knew what I was building. The alpha was supposed to be on the dedication page. Someone else was there instead. And the someone else turned out to be everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.